Hi, I'm Ira Wallace with Southern Exposure Seed Exchange here at Acorn Community Farm, and I'm for the soil because the soil is the basis of our agriculture. Soil grows our plants, and I love good soil.
It is my pleasure to welcome everyone to another episode of For the Soil, a Conversation. I'm your host, Jeff Ishee. Our episode this week is all about movers and shakers, people who inspire other people to get stuff done, like soil health. I've talked to a lot of people in my 25-year career in radio, but our guest this week, she is right up there with the best, and I promise you, you will be inspired by Karen Washington, just like I was. Also joining us will be Mary Sketch, coordinator of the Virginia Soil Health Coalition, and Eric Bendfeldt, Community Viability Specialist with Virginia Cooperative Extension. We do have a lot of ground to cover this week, so let's get right to the show. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of For the Soil, a Conversation. I'm your host, Jeff Ishee. Eric and Mary, I am eager to get to our topic today and our special guest. That's because in this episode, we're going to be talking about soil health and racial justice, amongst other topics. Eric, would you do us the honor of introducing our special guest today?
Thank you, Jeff. We're very pleased to have Karen Washington join us today. We were fortunate to have Karen come to Virginia and speak at the 2015 Virginia Farm to Table Conference and also speak at Virginia Tech. And she'll be speaking again in Virginia at the upcoming Virginia Association for Biological Farming Association and sharing her insights about soil health and the issue of racial justice. So we're very pleased to have Karen. And I'd just like to share one quote that I have from Karen. It says, "To grow your own food gives you power and dignity. You know exactly what you're eating because you grew it. It's good, it's nourishing, and you did this for yourself, your family, and your community." And Karen, I'm just so glad to have you and look forward to talking with you.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here today to speak with all of you.
And Karen, to kick things off, would love to hear from you on, your background and how you moved from your work as a physical therapist to working with the soil and the land and stewarding that work.
Yes, so I always start by telling people, especially people who have somewhat of a similar background, is that my parents weren't farmers. No one in my family were farmers. I just happened to live near an open lot. Believe it or not, as you can imagine, one time New York City had over 15,000 vacant lots, mostly in low-income neighborhoods and neighborhoods of color. And a lot of us got together to turn those empty lots into community gardens. And I like the word community gardens because it took a village, a community of people to turn those lots into beautiful gardens. And at that time, entering soil to be soil is more like dirt. And, people interchange dirt and soil together. And it wasn't until you really understood the mechanism behind growing food and that soil was alive and there was a difference between soil and dirt. And so it led me on a path of understanding soil structures, how to grow food, but also the impact that growing food and food itself and soil had on communities of color. And so I've been an activist striving for food and social justice, environmental justice, as well as a grower now on a 5-acre farm with friends of mine up in Chester, New York. So thanks for asking.
And Karen, as you've recently retired as a physical therapist, just speaking about further connections to health from individuals to community health to overall soil health, and you can continue to speak about that.
Yeah, definitely. Because you know what? When people started really talking about soil health, I started to look at the impact soil was having, not only in terms of food production, but soil itself, the fertility of soil impacted where you lived, where you play, and where you ate. And so, for instance, we talk about soil fertility, the mechanisms behind microbes and macrobes, fungi and bacteria, all which is all well and good. But then how does that resonate to the people who are affected by soil infertility? And so for me, as a food justice advocate, is trying to get people to understand that good soil means good health, and getting people to understand that, because it's hard for people to understand, especially people of color who've had such a disconnect from the land and from the soil, and really trying to get people to understand their history and their legacy, and they're part of agriculture, which embraces biodiversity and culture and things that doesn't resonate to people who are poor. And so for me, it's like starting out with, the conversation about history, like why we were brought here, and having that conversation so that people understand the connection to the experience of agriculture is that we were brought here enslaved. We're brought here not because we were dumb, but because of our knowledge of agriculture and the principles that we brought here, the principles about crop rotation and intercropping and soil mediation and irrigation, all those things. That starts as a starting point to get especially young Black and brown children who for so long had the myth that our legacy was great. But no, like so many other cultures, we were part of the agricultural system, the building of soil, the building of food, and starting having those conversations so people understand their place in agriculture. And then having people getting their hands dirty, especially young people coming into gardens or visiting farms and getting their hands into the soil and seeing how lively that soil is. Not be afraid of earthworms or little creatures that you see, but understanding, getting your fingers into that soil and taking that soil and smelling it and putting it through your fingers. I had to do that. I myself had to do that so that I could find my connection and sense of belonging into the soil, putting my hands into the soil and lifting it up and smelling it and looking at the little organisms that were there and not be afraid of it. And so starting with that sort of introduction to young people to understand their history, but also their relationship to soil. And one thing I try to tell young little girls and boys, especially people of color, I said, look at your skin color. Doesn't it look like soil to you? And so don't be afraid of it, but to embrace it. So, that's what I've been doing, and I'm enjoying every moment of it.
Karen, I have a question for you. You created such a visual in my mind a few moments ago when you talked about vacant lots in the inner city. What was the soil like when you first established those community gardens in those vacant lots, and how did you improve it?
Well, the thing about it is that, first of all, to live near a vacant lot, back then we didn't know that was environmental injustice, but the vacant lots were full with abandoned cars, tires. At that time, drug dealing was very rampant. So you had, needles, and you had garbage. And every time you would clean out with the help of the community, the next day it would be filled with garbage. And so, first of all, garbage, abandoned car parts, but then a lot of these vacant lots were once buildings. And as a result, most of the lead, especially from lead paint, was inside the soil. So many of us, had to do soil mediation. What does that mean? First of all, being able to take a lot of that soil out, but then you had to sort of build soil structure. You had limited resources. So what people did was start learning about the concept of composting. Now, think about back in the late 1970s and early 80s. That word compost was foreign to people, but yet there were people who had knowledge of what it is to bring back healthy soil. How can you mitigate and how can you increase healthy soil? Well, instead of taking away especially plant material, household material or fruits and vegetables, put it back into the soil. Instead of leaving the soil bare year after year, whenever you started growing, chop it down and making sure that it would bring back soil. So it started that conversation about composting and putting stuff back into the soil and not leaving the soil bare. So those are the beginning concepts of changing the dynamics of the soil in urban areas.
Karen, we talk a lot about the networks within the soil, those microbial networks, and building the diversity of that. How do you see the work that you're doing on more of that metaphorical side, building community networks? And, how does working in the soil help build those connections among diverse communities?
Oh, definitely. And I think it starts with this sort of intergenerational knowledge that we're having, sitting down and having people who have knowledge about soil fertility, about how to grow food, about food justice, and sitting down and sharing that information. For so long, I think that we have been separate. We have been separate in hoarding the knowledge that we've have attained. And so it's really, really good that now you're starting to see this intergenerational aspect where the youth and the elders are now sitting down and cross-pollinating, so to speak, the language and the knowledge that they have, and sharing that knowledge was really, really good.
And Karen, you had also helped to co-found the Black Urban Growers Association or organization. And if you can, I know that's been involved with soil health and racial justice. If you can speak more about that as well.
Yeah, the reason why we started the Black Urban Growers is because of the fact that many of us with good intentions would go to different farming conferences and workshops and never see the diversity that we have. As farmers, we embrace diversity, but sitting in a pool of whiteness and not being able to see your participation in agriculture, we started to have this conversation so that young Black and brown people could see farmers that look like them. For so long, you would go to farmers markets, you go to a conference, and you would never see Black farmers. And they were out there. So the conference was for young people to see, yes, there are Black farmers. There are Black people who are working on soil. There are Black people who are working in terms of environmental justice. And having that conference so that, again, what is our place as a people when it comes to the development of agriculture here in these United States? It takes a village, it takes diversity, and it's not one voice, one race, one color. It's the multitude of all of us coming together to making sure that this planet, the elements of this planet, is here for everybody. And I think that's important.
Karen, I have one other question for you, and that's about I get excited when I listen to you talk and I want to go out and work in my garden. You inspire a lot of people, but let me ask this, who inspired you? Was there one individual, maybe a book or a magazine article you read or a person you spoke to who lit the fire for Karen Washington?
That's a difficult, I would say, believe it or not, my patients as a physical therapist, believe it or not, as a physical therapist, I was treating a lot of Black and Latinx patients who were farmers, and yet they had succumbed to diet-related diseases, hypertension, obesity because of the food that they were eating. And so when I would talk to them and I said, I'm a gardener, I'm a farmer. And oh, Ms. Washington, how could you? Farming is so hard. I hated it. But then when I would talk about and embrace how much fun I was having, my fingers in the soil, the food that I was eating, they would say, Ms. Washington, you're right. We grew up on sick a day in our life. We never went to a grocery store. We got everything from the soil, from the farm, how we treated our animals. And that gave me such inspiration because all of a sudden it clicked in their head how lost they were when they came away from the land and how powerful that recollection of a growing up farm meant something. And so I would say the inspiration were my patients that were once, grew up on farms and now are relegated to, medication, but then all of a sudden realize how important eating healthy meant being healthy.
Well, you are certainly an inspiring person. And I know that Mary and Eric would join me in saying, what an inspiration you are. As soon as we finish recording this, I know it's January, but I'm heading out to the garden. I'm going to find something to do in the garden today. Thank you for joining us. We do like to highlight one of the 4 core principles of soil health, in each episode of For the Soil, a Conversation. And today I wanted to mention that I practice one of those principles in my own backyard vegetable garden every fall when I place deciduous leaves on top of my raised beds. You know, those leaves, they gradually break down and they become topsoil eventually. And as they're breaking down, they provide an ideal environment for earthworms and other soil organisms. So keep your soil covered even in the wintertime, and use deciduous leaves to cover your topsoil in your own backyard vegetable garden. Also, I'd like to challenge each of our listeners to take a pledge to improve the soil health in your own world, whether it be a community garden, a peach orchard, or maybe in your soybean field. You can take that pledge by visiting our website at forthesoil.org. That is the digit 4thesoil.org. Well, Eric, Mary, and Karen, it has been a pleasure having you on this episode of For the Soil. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Karen.
Thank you.
For the Soil, a Conversation is made possible with funding support from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation and the Agua Fund. Other partners include the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Natural Resources Conservation Service, Virginia Cooperative Extension, Virginia State University, Virginia Department of Conservation and Recreation, and partners of the Virginia Soil Health Coalition. Views expressed on this podcast are those of each individual guest. To download a copy of this or any other episode, visit the website forthesoil.org. And if you have a specific question about soil health, contact your local extension office, your local USDA service center, or a Soil and Water Conservation District office. Music used during today's program was provided courtesy of the Flip Charts. All rights reserved. For the Soil, a Conversation is produced by On the Farm Radio in collaboration with Virginia Tech. I'm your host, Jeff Ishee.